In this episode, we are going to look at a part of security that is easy to misunderstand because people often picture data protection as a single lock on a single file. Real data protection is much more about judgment, context, and consistent treatment across the full life of information. A company may have thousands or millions of records, documents, messages, reports, images, and system outputs, and not all of them deserve the same level of protection at every moment. Some information can be shared widely with little risk, some should stay inside a team, some may require limited access because it affects privacy or business operations, and some is sensitive enough that poor handling could create legal, financial, or operational damage very quickly. That is why classification, labeling, masking, sanitization, and handling belong together. They are not 5 random security words. They are 5 ways of deciding what data is, how sensitive it is, how clearly that sensitivity should be communicated, how exposure can be reduced, how information should be cleaned up when it is no longer needed, and how people and systems should behave around it every day. Before we continue, a quick note. This audio course is part of our companion study series. The first book is a detailed study guide that explains the exam and helps you prepare for it with confidence. The second is a Kindle-only ebook with 1,000 flashcards you can use on your mobile device or Kindle for quick review. You can find both at Cyber.Me in the Bare Metal Study Guide series. A useful starting point is to recognize that data protection begins long before anyone applies a technical control. It begins with understanding that information has different value, different sensitivity, and different consequences if it is exposed, altered, lost, or mishandled. A public event flyer and a file containing payroll records are both data, but they do not create the same risk if someone copies them to the wrong place. An internal draft strategy document and a product brochure may both be business materials, but the damage caused by inappropriate sharing would be very different. This is why strong data protection is never just about storing everything behind one wall and hoping that wall holds. It is about making decisions that match protection to the nature of the information. If an organization does not understand what kinds of data it has, where that data lives, who uses it, and why it matters, then every other protective step becomes weaker. Classification, labeling, masking, sanitization, and handling are all ways of turning that understanding into repeatable behavior instead of leaving it to guesswork. Classification is the first major concept because it gives the organization a structured way to sort information by sensitivity, value, and required care. At a basic level, classification means placing data into categories that help people decide how strongly it should be protected. Different organizations use different labels for their categories, but the pattern is usually familiar. Some information is intended for public use, some is for internal business activity, some is confidential, and some may be highly restricted because exposure would create serious harm. The exact names matter less than the logic behind them. Classification should reflect the consequences of misuse, not just personal preference or habit. If information would create privacy damage, financial harm, competitive loss, regulatory trouble, safety risk, or reputational damage when exposed or changed, then the classification should reflect that. The purpose of classification is not to create bureaucracy for its own sake. The purpose is to give people a shared language for understanding what kind of care the data deserves before anyone decides where it should go or who should see it. Classification matters because security becomes inconsistent very quickly when people treat all data as equally sensitive or equally harmless. If everything is treated as critical, people become numb to the warnings and start ignoring them. If everything is treated casually, highly sensitive information ends up mixed into ordinary workflows with too little protection. Good classification helps prevent both problems by creating a more realistic scale of sensitivity. It allows the organization to protect the most important data more carefully while avoiding unnecessary friction around low-risk material. This also helps with prioritization. Teams can spend more effort on the information that deserves stronger controls instead of wasting the same level of attention on content that carries little real impact. Beginners should understand that classification is not about making documents sound dramatic. It is about giving the business a practical way to match protection to consequence. Once information is classified thoughtfully, The rest of the protection model has something solid to work from instead of depending on broad assumptions and inconsistent personal judgment. Labeling is closely related to classification, but it is not the same thing. Classification is the decision about what kind of data something is and how sensitive it should be treated. Labeling is the act of marking that information in a way that makes the classification visible to people and systems. In other words, classification is the judgment, while labeling is the communication of that judgment. A label may appear in a document header, a metadata field, a storage tag, an email marking, or some other visible or machine-readable form that tells others how the information should be handled. This matters because a classification that exists only in someone's mind is much less useful than one that can travel with the data and influence behavior consistently. If a file is sensitive but nobody can tell that by looking at it or processing it, then the chance of mishandling rises sharply. Labeling makes the protection expectation easier to follow because it keeps the sensitivity information close to the data instead of hiding it in a separate policy manual that nobody remembers in daily work. A label is useful only if it leads to meaningful handling, which is why handling rules are the next critical part of the picture. Handling means the day-to-day behavior expected when people or systems create, store, transmit, process, share, print, copy, archive, or delete data. Once information has been classified and labeled, the natural next question is what those decisions require in practice. Can the data be emailed freely or only through approved protected channels? Can it be shared outside the organization or only internally? Can it be stored on personal devices or only in managed locations? Can it be printed, exported, or copied into collaboration tools? Handling rules give real shape to protection because they convert classification into action. Without handling guidance, classification stays too abstract to help much. A beginner should think of handling as the operational behavior tied to the data's sensitivity. It is the difference between saying this matters and showing what people should actually do because it matters. Good handling also follows data across its full life cycle rather than focusing only on one moment, such as storage. Information is created, edited, shared, analyzed, copied into other systems, summarized in reports, backed up, archived, and eventually removed. At each step, the risk can change. A sensitive spreadsheet may begin in a controlled folder but later be attached to an email, copied into a presentation, exported into a dataset, or printed for a meeting. If handling rules do not follow the data through those transitions, then protection becomes weak exactly where real work is happening. This is one reason why data security is so challenging in practice. The data keeps moving, and every movement creates a chance for the original sensitivity decision to be forgotten. Strong handling discipline keeps protection attached to the data even as the form, location, and audience shift over time. That is how organizations reduce the risk that information leaves a carefully protected system only to become casually exposed the moment it enters a common workflow or a more convenient tool. Masking addresses a different but very important question, which is how to reduce exposure when someone needs to use data without seeing every sensitive detail. At a basic level, masking means hiding or obscuring part of the data so that the information remains useful for some purpose while reducing the risk of unnecessary disclosure. A customer service representative may need to confirm the last few digits of an account identifier without seeing the full number. A testing team may need realistic data formats without access to real personal details. A business report may need trends and totals without revealing every individual record. Masking is valuable because many tasks do not actually require full exposure of the underlying data. When organizations fail to recognize that, they often grant broader visibility than needed simply because the data was easier to present in its raw form. Masking supports least privilege for data by asking how much of the information is truly necessary for the task, and then hiding the rest where possible. This is where beginners should clearly separate masking from encryption and from ordinary access denial. Encryption is about protecting data so that unauthorized parties cannot meaningfully read it without the correct key or approved method of access. Access denial is about preventing someone from reaching the information at all. Masking is different because the user may be authorized to interact with the data in some way, but not authorized to see every sensitive element in full detail. That distinction matters because many business processes involve partial legitimate need. A team member might need enough information to verify identity, troubleshoot an issue, review a trend, or support a transaction, but not enough to expose every private or highly sensitive field. Masking is therefore a precision tool. It helps organizations avoid the false choice between showing everything and showing nothing. Used well, it reduces unnecessary visibility while still supporting the work that has to happen. That makes it extremely practical in environments where people need useful data but do not need complete raw exposure. Sanitization goes further than masking because it is about removing or transforming sensitive information so that the original protected data can no longer be recovered or misused in the same way. In some situations, the organization wants to use data for testing, analysis, training, sharing, or disposal, but does not want the original sensitive content to remain intact. Sanitization helps with that by removing, altering, or destroying sensitive elements in a more permanent or more thorough way than simple masking. For example, a team may sanitize a data set before using it for development work or sanitize storage media before the hardware leaves controlled use. The big idea is that sanitization changes the data or medium so that the sensitive content is no longer meaningfully available in its prior form. This is why sanitization is especially important when information is leaving one trust environment for another, when equipment is being reused or retired, or when data should remain useful only in a much less sensitive form than the original source. A beginner should also understand the difference between sanitization and simple deletion. Deleting a file often means removing the normal pointer or easy path to the information, but not necessarily ensuring that the underlying data cannot be recovered through other means. Sanitization is concerned with making the protected content unavailable in a much more reliable and intentional way. This is why it matters for both digital information and physical media. If a device, storage system, or printed collection contains sensitive information, organizations need a trustworthy way to ensure that the content is not still lingering after the item is reused, transferred, or discarded. Sanitization is therefore not only a technical cleanup step. It is a trust decision about whether the organization is truly ready to let the data or the storage leave its current protection boundary. If that decision is made carelessly, old information can reappear long after people thought it was gone, creating exactly the kind of delayed exposure that is hard to detect and harder to explain afterward. These ideas become much more powerful when you see how they connect instead of treating them as isolated controls. Classification decides what the data means from a sensitivity perspective. Labeling communicates that decision to humans and systems. Handling tells everyone what behavior should follow from that classification. Masking reduces exposure when partial use is needed without full visibility. Sanitization removes or transforms sensitive content when the original form should no longer remain available. Together, these actions create a layered approach to data protection that follows information through creation, use, sharing, and eventual disposal. If one layer is missing, the system becomes weaker. Classification without labeling may leave users unsure how to behave. Labeling without handling may create warnings that no one knows how to follow. Handling without masking may expose more than necessary during legitimate work. Storage without sanitization may leave old sensitive content behind after its business need ended. Good security is built by making these elements reinforce one another instead of relying on any one of them to solve the whole problem alone. A simple example can make the full chain easier to picture. Imagine a human resources team working with employee compensation records. The information is classified as highly sensitive because improper exposure could affect privacy, trust, legal obligations, and internal morale. The files are labeled clearly so that both people and systems understand the sensitivity. Handling rules limit where the files may be stored, who may access them, how they may be transmitted, and whether they can be printed or exported. When managers need to review summary trends, masking may hide individual identifiers or full salary details that are not necessary for the decision at hand. Later, if selected data is needed for training or testing, sanitization may be used so the resulting data set no longer reveals real employees. Eventually, when certain records or media are no longer required, sanitization supports safe removal. This example shows that protecting data is not one decision made once. It is a sequence of connected decisions that keep the information aligned with its sensitivity at every stage. Several misconceptions make this topic harder until they are challenged directly. One misconception is that classification is just paperwork, when in reality, poor classification often leads directly to poor access, poor sharing, and poor storage decisions. Another is that labeling alone protects data, when labels are only useful if people and systems actually respond to them with the right handling behavior. Some people think masking and sanitization are basically the same, but masking usually preserves limited usefulness while hiding details, whereas sanitization is meant to remove or transform the sensitive content much more completely. Another common mistake is assuming data handling is only the responsibility of technical teams. In truth, managers, users, business owners, analysts, developers, and administrators all affect how data moves and whether it stays aligned with its intended protection level. Data security breaks down quickly when people believe the information protects itself simply because it lives in a modern system or carries a warning mark somewhere in the corner. By the end of this discussion, the most important takeaway should feel practical and connected. Protecting data through classification, labeling, masking, sanitization, and handling means building a system where information is understood, clearly identified, exposed only as much as necessary, transformed or removed safely when appropriate, and treated consistently throughout its life cycle. Classification gives data its sensitivity meaning. Labeling makes that meaning visible. Handling turns that meaning into everyday action. Masking limits unnecessary exposure while still allowing useful work. Sanitization ensures sensitive content does not remain available when it no longer should. When organizations apply these ideas together, data protection becomes much stronger because security follows the information instead of depending only on the place where it happened to be stored last. That is the real goal. Strong data security is not about protecting a folder in isolation. It is about protecting meaning, sensitivity, and trust as information moves through the real work of the business.
Thanks for listening. For more audio courses, daily newsletters, and more, please visit baremetalcyber.com.